Hey guys, Naz here. Today I'm going to be taking you over how I both patterned and put together this little leopard gecko. I was super happy with how he came out. I started by making him out of white minky and then finishing him up with airbrushing. I won't be covering how I did the airbrushing in the video, but if you want to go back and check out my airbrushing for beginners tutorial or any of my other sort of advanced airbrushing tutorials, they'll go over more about how you can achieve this effect. So I had a lovely person on Twitter send me some images of their leopard geckos to use as references for making this tutorial because I wanted to have a bunch of references to use. So they sent me some pictures of two of their very cute leopard geckos. We don't have leopard geckos here in Australia, so forgive me if I'm sort of not very familiar with them. So I've gathered sort of the main references that I want to be using for this gecko. The most important references that you're going to need is a top view and a side view. So you could go somewhere like Google Images and try and find images like that. They don't have to be absolutely perfect top and side, but it does help the closer you can get, because otherwise you're going to be sort of guesstimating and trying to make that top and side views more symmetrical and accurate. So you can see here the head shape is probably the most complicated part of this pattern. The legs, body and tail aren't very complicated, but the head has sort of a bit more of a refined shape. So I really put a lot of work into the head pattern for this for you guys. So I remade the head about 6 times, I think, to try and really get it to look like a leopard gecko, because they do have that very bulbous kind of head with that sort of small nose at the front in that V shape. So here you can see our references from the top, from the side. I had a few more, but these were sort of the ones that I use most in patterning. I also got this good picture of the top view of the tail, because that's sort of an important shape that we want to reference when we're making our tail pattern. We're essentially just going to be tracing the shape that we want our tail to be and doubling that to have a top and a bottom. I did end up making the tail a lot more fat and bulbous. I think the leopard geckos can have sort of different levels of thickness in their tail depending on how much sort of fat is stored in there. So this girl, or guy here, sorry, I'm not quite sure, they sort of have a bit of a thinner tail, so I wanted to have more of a, I guess, a cartoony rendition with the big fat tail. So for the body, we're going to be making it out of 3 pieces. We're going to have sort of a bottom piece, and then we're going to have 2 side pieces. So that's quite a simple body shape that we're going to be making here. The legs/feet are very simple. I'm just going to be tracing sort of the best looking profile version of the leg, using that for all of the leg shapes, and then I'm going to pattern separately like the hand, I guess, or the claw, because that's going to be sitting on a different plane. So the leg is going to sort of be going up and down, and the foot or the claw is going to be laying flat on the ground, going horizontal. So I'm going to make those in 2 different pieces. For the tail, I noticed that they have sort of these ridges going, or lines going all the way up to the tail. So I decided to do some thread sculpting to get sort of that raised and indented feature in the tail. So that's something that we're going to be doing as well. And then we'll move on to the head pattern last, which is the most complicated thing. So when I'm making a head pattern, I like to look at the different planes of the head and sort of, just based on my experience, try and guess what would work best when trying to make a pattern. So I started off with thinking that I could sort of make 2 side pieces and then a gusset that runs from the top of the head, like from the front of the nose, up the back of the head, around, down and up to the tip of the chin sort of thing. I ended up modifying that a little bit, but you can see here I'm just working out in my head different ways to attempt this pattern. So you can see here I'm adding things like a little lump for where the sort of eyebrow or eyelid ridges are going to be. So that's something that we did include. It's something that you can include in patterns like crocodiles or dinosaurs or things like that. They usually have that more pronounced brow, or even characters like Charizard have things like that as well. So what I did is I ended up having the 2 side pieces. I also broke those up sort of where the cheek is, because it balloons outwards. I added a dart there to sort of balloon it out even more to really get that, so they have that really narrow snout, and then as it goes to the back of the head it gets very wide and bulbous. So I added that detail there to sort of make it look a lot more like a leopard gecko. And then I had a gusset that goes all the way around the head. So I think I started it and ended it at the back of the head because that's going to be hidden by where we're going to ladder stitch the back of the head onto the front of the neck, and that ran all the way down the back of the head, sort of down under the chin, up the nose, up the top of the head and back to that point there, and that's how I sort of worked it out in the end. So the first thing that I decided to pattern was the tail, because that's the simplest part of the pattern. We're really just tracing the silhouette that we want the tail to look like from the top. So you can see here I sort of traced the bulbous shape of the tail and then added a curve at the end. I didn't want to pattern the curve into the end of the tail because if I'd left it straight, it would have been kind of hard to position it or forcibly position it into that sort of nice curl or curve that they have. You could use something like wire, but personally I just think it's nicer to pattern that curve into your actual pattern if that's what you want to do. So I'm just making sure that my tail pattern is nice and symmetrical, at least for the base, sort of the bulbous part of the tail, and then it becomes asymmetrical as I sort of put in that taper towards the end and curve it in one direction. I also ended up sort of ballooning the tail out a fair bit, as I mentioned earlier. I wanted the tail to be quite chubby and cartoony, and just sort of, I like that look on the leopard geckos when they have that really big fat sort of bulby tail. You also want to make the tail a little bit thicker than you want it to turn out if you are going to be doing the thread sculpting, because that's going to sort of constrict your tail with loops. So you're going to want to make it just a little bit bigger than you think it's going to need to be eventually, and that will sort of compensate for the pulling inwards that that's going to do. So this is essentially the tail pattern done. I just did a few tweaks to make it thicker a couple of times, and you're really just going to use this, two pieces, one facing one way, one mirrored the other way, and sew them together, leaving an opening where sort of the front of the tail meets the rear of the body of the gecko. So continuing our trend of patterning from back to front, now we're going to be patterning the body of the gecko, and we're going to be making this out of 3 pieces. So we're going to have the bottom piece, and that's going to sort of establish the width and general sort of top view shape of the gecko. And what I'm doing is sort of imagining what the gecko would look like if she was lying perfectly straight from the top view. This is at a slight angle and they are very wiggly creatures, so I imagine it's hard to get a picture of them sort of very straight from the top. So what I did is I just drew a horizontal line and I traced what I think sort of the neck flare would look like, moved that into the approximate position in the middle of that straight line, making sure that the back of this body pattern is the same width as the width of the start of the tail, so that when we hand sew them together they're going to be the same size. And then I sort of just made the rest of the gecko's body like a vase shape sort of thing, so starting out thick at where it meets the head, thinning out where the neck is, ballooning out where the tummy is, and then pinching back down where it's going to join in at the tail. So really this is just an exercise in sort of guesstimating what you think the animal would look like from the top, especially with long animals like this. And I think it's sort of just do your best guess. I think a lot of these lizards are going to have a similar sort of belly shape. If you can find pictures of a gecko belly, then that's all the better, but this is just keeping things nice and simple, and I think it worked out quite well in sort of replicating their body shape in the end. So you can see here I'm just cutting it down the middle, copying it, pasting it and flipping it, just to make sure that our belly pattern is nice and symmetrical. Now here's a really fun trick, I'm not sure if I've shown you guys before, but once you've generated a belly pattern like this, especially for sort of long and relatively flat-ish characters, I mean this has a little bit of bulge to it, but our stuffing will provide that bulge. You can actually use your belly piece to pattern your side pieces that will form, the sides and the back of your character. So I've duplicated the belly onto a separate layer, and this is going to be our side. You're going to cut it in half, because now we have a piece that is going to be sewn to the side of one half of our belly piece, and then the rest of it can balloon upwards into sort of the silhouette of our gecko that we want it to look like from the side. So you can see here I've sort of lined up the side piece of this piece that I'm patterning here, where I think it will line up with on the gecko, so it's going to be where the belly meets the side. And then I'm just tracing the silhouette on our side pattern piece of the gecko. So that line that I just drew there is going to be the back and the top of the neck. So we're going to duplicate this side piece twice. So we're going to have one belly piece and then two side pieces, and you're going to sew, you can see the bit that says side on both of them. You're going to be sewing those both together, and then you're going to be sewing the two pieces that say back together. So that's going to form your three-piece pattern, and that's how we generate our three-piece pattern for a character in this kind of shape, which is very handy and a nice quick way of making sure that your side seams are going to match each other. Now the next thing we're going to be patterning is the hands and legs. I just chose an image, this portion of the image that has a nicely shaped leg in my opinion. You could pattern your legs stretched out or bent like this, it just depends on what you want to do, but I wanted to keep this fairly simple, so I just chose the leg that I thought had the nicest sort of silhouette view, and I based all my leg patterns on this, obviously just flipping them depending on each side. So my gecko has sort of a crouching position, but as I said, you can pattern sort of the back legs could be crouching and then one of the front legs could be straighter and reaching out, but that's just a really simple pattern, so use two of that pattern piece for each leg, sew that together, leave a little opening at the bottom because that's where we're going to later stitch it to the hands. So this is sort of the closest I could find to a completely sort of flat image of their little hands. I scaled this pattern quite large, so it will still print on a standard piece of paper, but also so that we can have those little feet, little hands at an accurate size. If we made this pattern too small, these fingers or claws would be nearly impossible to sew and turn inside out, so that's why I made this pattern just a little bit larger so that we could still have those claws to scale with the rest of the pattern, and they weren't too hard to turn inside out. I didn't really have too much trouble with them. But if you are sort of starting out and you find that these hands are too difficult to turn inside out, just make them a little bit bigger, it'll look fine, as long as you don't make them like 3 times as big. A little bit bigger to make things easier on yourself is going to be no problem. And I just sketched that little hand, made sure that it was symmetrical because I'm going to be using it for every single claw on this gecko or every single hand on the gecko. And I also made sure to balloon sort of the rear of the hand out a little bit, as you'll see in a second, and that is going to just give us somewhere to intersect the bottom of that leg to sort of the rear heel of that hand there. And that's pretty much the hand and legs patterned, very simple, just really trying to make things symmetrical and picking the nicest sort of view of the hands and legs that we possibly can. Now we're going to be moving on to the hardest part of this pattern, and that is patterning the head. I tried not to make it too crazy for you guys, but I also didn't want to make it so simple that it didn't look like a leopard gecko. So I did make some tweaks between what you're seeing me pattern here and the final pattern, but generally it's the same. The only real big change that I made is initially I thought that I could combine the two side head pieces at the nose and sort of have that wrap around the front of the nose in sort of a straight manner, but I ended up dividing those side pieces and ended up putting a gusset that went all the way around as I described earlier. So I went through before and I sort of identified the different planes that make up the shape of the leopard gecko's head. So one of the main ones was this side head piece, and you can see that I've put in a little bulge at the top there for where the eyebrow is going to be, or the eyelid. We're also going to be ending this not all the way at the back. We're going to add a little bit of shape behind the cheeks there. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to pattern sort of the little half moon shape, or a little quarter circle shape that is going to sit between the back of the eyebrow, sort of that eyebrow ridge, and the gusset that runs between sort of the middle of the head. So I'm just copying that side pattern there. I've just drawn like a little lower swoop, and we're going to separate that from the side head pattern, and that is going to form that little sort of eyebrow shape that we're going to need to sort of push those eyebrows out there. And you're just going to sew the side that has that little line on it. So the top of this side is going to match up with the top of the side piece that has that eyebrow bulge, and you're going to sew those two together, and then you'll be sewing the gusset to the top of this side piece, and then it's going to balloon out where you've sewn this piece, and then it'll meet back where the nose is and go back down the nose underneath and around sort of thing. So if we go back to our gecko reference, that red piece there is the side piece that we've just patterned, kind of badly foreshortened by poor drawing me, and then we have the little half moon shapes that we've added. They're going to be those pieces that push out and give that sort of 3D eyebrow effect. And then our gusset is going to fill in the space in between and, you know, go all the way across the top of the head, the front of the nose, under the chin and around the back. So these are all the pattern pieces I came up with for the head after I realised that I didn't want those side pieces to connect. So you're going to see me sort of fixing those into what became the final pattern. So you can see that I tried to join the nose at the front, but it didn't sort of give me the look that I wanted to do. So it's usually easier to just put a gusset that goes all the way around, and that usually gives a much more reliable shape. So I'm going to align the bottom piece that will form sort of the bottom gusset that is the chin, the broad part of the chin, where that's going to line up with the tip of the nose, and I'm going to put the piece that is going to form the gusset for the top of the head, aligning that with the top of the nose, and I'm essentially just going to form this into one single piece, kind of like an hourglass. If you haven't seen me make a gusset before, you can see all these little reference points that I've put along our side head pieces, and what you can do is you can take a measuring tape and you can measure, you know, how long those pieces are from point A to point B, or point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. And you can measure them, draw a straight line, copy those measurements onto the straight line, and then mark horizontal lines everywhere that you want to, that you have those reference lines, and then you are going to, you know, put in the width at each of those horizontal lines that you want the gusset to be, and then it's really just a matter of trial and error, working out how wide you want each piece to be. So here you can see that the pieces of the gusset that are going to line up with the tip of the nose, I want those to be very thin, so I'm making them, you know, even thinner than you can see here. I'm sort of tapering in that hourglass shape so it's as thin as possible without being too tricky to sew, and that's going to line up with the front of the nose, and then you can see the top and the bottom are pretty much the same shape. They're going to align up with, you know, the back of the head. They sort of start small where they match up with the nose and then flare out to the back of the head. And then I also have a rear piece, which is the rear part of the head that you can see in the top right corner if I zoom out, and that's going to be sewn, the top of that piece, it's like a rectangle piece, is going to be sewn to the top of the hourglass, the bottom is going to be sewn to the bottom of the hourglass, and that's going to create a gusset that runs the whole way around our side pieces that we have here. I also show you in a little bit, I ended up splitting these side pieces into two, where the cheek is going to balloon out, and I'll show you how to do that so we can really have that cheek puff out in that position that we wanted to, and I added darts on each side of that puff of that dividing line. The pattern that you see here is an earlier edition of the pattern before I've refined it a bit more for you guys. So you can see here that I'm overlaying images of my pattern work in progress over the pictures that we have of the leopard gecko, and they do have a quite complicated head shape. So you can see in this picture of the side view that my initial attempts at the head were way too compact, so I ended up lengthening the snout to sort of match that reference even more. Here are some little changes that I just made to the pattern as I was refining it. I thought I would show you guys. I didn't make the width of the bottom of the neck at the front of the body piece match up with the width of the back of the head. So this is, you can see here, this is the head top piece, and that needs to be the same width as our bottom of our neck piece. You can see this is sort of all over the place. This is me editing the pattern at different stages, but I wanted to show you guys you might need to tweak different widths to make sure that they line up, because we're patterning this in many different parts. So we have the tail, the body and the head. So you want to make sure that the back of the head is the same width as the front of your neck, and the front of your body is the same width, or the back of the body is the same width as the front of the tail. So that's just something to keep in mind. Another thing that I ended up changing as I was patterning is I made an indent in the gusset where it's going to line up with that sort of quarter sphere shape that makes up the eyebrow. I initially thought that I didn't need it in there to help balloon sort of that eyebrow shape outwards, but it turns out that I did need to sort of create those little divots, as you can see here, in the sort of top head portion of the gusset, and that's just going to pull the eyes in a bit, and they're still going to have that nice bulbous shape that the leopard geckos have, but it just didn't come out with a very nice shape before I added that indent to sort of pull it inwards. It's kind of like the shape you add to pull your legs in when you're making a quadruped pattern, sort of in that armpit area. So this is me adding the dart in to sort of balloon out the cheeks. I'm also going to balloon out the cheeks by putting a seam where the cheek is going to run down the side of our head side pattern. So you can see that I've just drawn a line where I want it to balloon out. I've separated the pieces and I'm going to balloon those out pretty much in exactly the same shape on both sides, and that's just a really quick way of adding some width to an area where you're adding a seam. So you can see I've just ballooned it out using this little tool, eyeballing it. You can, if you're doing this on a piece of paper, you can sort of flip it and make sure that you're ballooning them the same amount, but as long as you can still sew these two pieces back together to form one single headpiece, that's fine. I'm also going to be adding, I think I added a couple of darts to start with, but then I refined it down to just adding one dart as I pattern tested. But if you want to learn how to add darts, I have a pattern tutorial on how to pattern darts, which is very simple. And here I'm just doing a quick and dirty version where I've just ballooned it out, and I know that I'll have excess fabric that I can pinch in on, so I'm adding these darts here. As I mentioned earlier, I ended up having one dart on each side in the final version, but I'm just adding these darts here to balloon that cheek out as much as I possibly can. So here we have all our patterns. We have our head gusset, we have our belly, we have our two side back pieces of the body, and then we have our two tail pieces, and we have a whole bunch of legs, whole bunch of hands. We have the back of our head, we have our eyebrows, we have our side pieces and our side cheeks, which will be sewn together after we sew those darts. And that's pretty much it. Obviously for the hands you need two pieces for each hand, 4 legs, same with so 2 pieces for each leg. So the first thing you're going to do is sew all the darts that we have in our pattern here. So I'm going to sew these 2 darts. I ended up adding these darts to the top of the head to balloon those sort of cheeks out even more. You're going to be sewing the top of the back head piece to the sort of top of the gusset, and the back or the bottom of the back head piece to the bottom of the gusset. And it's really it's a symmetrical piece if you keep it going horizontal, so all you're doing there is really having the nap run downwards. You're going to get your 2 side pieces and sew the back together, and then once you've sewn the back together, you're going to lay it out and you're going to sew each side piece of the side piece or the lower part of the side piece onto the side of our belly. We're going to leave the front and the back open for stuffing. The tail's easy. You just put your 2 pieces of the tail together, sew all the way around, leaving the front open for stuffing and for attaching to the rear of the body. Here we have our side head pieces and our side cheeks, and those darts are going to be sewn first, and then we'll sew sort of the front side piece to the cheek side piece after we've sewn those darts. And as I mentioned, on the final pattern there's only 1 dart on each side rather than the 2. I liked that look a little bit better. Then you're going to be sewing the eyebrow pieces. So the top of that eyebrow chunk is going to be sewn to the top of the side, the bulge where the eyebrow is on that side headpiece. And you're not going to be sewing the bottom, you're just going to be sewing the top ridge, so sort of half of that quarter sphere pattern. For the legs, very simple. You're just going to sew all the way around, leaving the bottom of the leg open for stuffing and attaching to the foot. For the foot, I sewed the whole thing around. I used a short stitch and I sewed around twice, and then I just made a tiny little cut where the leg is going to intersect. So you can see here with the head, we've sewn our darts, we've sewn our front and back head pieces together, we've sewn our gusset into one sort of single piece, we're going to only sew one piece at a time. The first piece we're going to do is the back of the cheek is going to be sewn to that back head piece of the gusset. So after you've sewn that on both sides, then you're going to sew the top section of the gusset to the top of the side head, and then you're going to sew the bottom of the side head to the bottom gusset area. It's definitely easier to do this one section at a time because it has sort of these abrupt changes in angles, like where the nose is and at the back of the head. You don't want to try and pin it and sew all the way around at once because it's just going to be way too hard. Even I struggle to do it. So just pin and sew one sort of straight-ish area at a time, and that will give you a far better result. So I've sewn all our pieces together. I'm going to turn them all inside out and start stuffing them. You could choose to add wire in the legs. I didn't find that it needed it because my gecko lays on his belly sort of thing. So if you want him to be suspended off the ground and not lay on his belly, you could add wire going through each of the legs, through his belly and into the leg on the other side, and that would support it and brace it better. But I didn't really find that it needed it. You can sort of stuff as firmly or as softly as you want on this pattern. I would stuff a little bit firmly in the head just to get that correct shape, but for the rest of it you can keep it a little soft if that's what you like. I tend to stuff a bit more firmly as they sort of last a little bit better. Now we're doing the tricky part, and that's stuffing and turning inside out the hands or the toes. So you can see here I've sewn all the way around. I sewed them twice just because this kind of seam, this sort of thin area, is one that's very likely to pop a seam. So I sewed twice just to make sure it was extra strong, and I'm just making a tiny little incision, just enough for me to poke stuffing through where the top of our foot's going to intersect with the bottom of the leg. And then I'm going to proceed to turn all of these inside out. You can use something like these forceps that I have here. Another tip is to sort of find something with a narrow point. I have a specific tool that you can buy from a sewing store. I think it's called a purple thing or something like that. Or you could even use like the tip of a pencil or something like that. And it's actually easier rather than using forceps like this or tweezers like this to push from the base to push it inside out. You can try and push from the tip of the toe on the outside and get it to cave in on itself, and then continue to push that all the way inside out. That's just a bit of a tip for turning inside out very small, thin things like this. But just keep going, don't be too rough with it, and try and just do one toe at a time, persuade them through until you have every single one of those little toes turned inside out. You could also wire these toes if you really wanted to. It would be a bit fiddly because they are kind of small, but if you did that you could potentially pose the claws in more sort of like your typical claw shape, like a bit more scrunched up. I just left them sort of a wide open gecko hand here because I didn't really think it needed it, but it just depends on the look that you're going for. So you can see that it hasn't been too tricky for me to turn these inside out, but as I mentioned earlier, if you are finding this really hard, you can make these hands a little bit bigger, make this shape a little bit bigger, and that will make them easier to turn inside out. So now onto another time-consuming part of doing all these tiny little fingers and tiny little feet sort of thing. I'm just going to get my stuffing, and I'm going to make a ton of tiny little stuffing balls. I'm probably going to use maybe 2 or 3 of these in each of the fingers, but you just want them quite small, and breaking this up sort of helps with the stuffing. I broke up roughly as many as I think I would need, and then I'm going to use these tweezers and I'm going to persuade those into the end of each toe, sort of making sure that those toes are well stuffed so that they're going to keep their shape for as long as possible. And yeah, you're really just going to repeat this step for the whole rest of the feet. Enjoy making characters with a whole lot of toes. It's a little bit of work, but it's not as difficult as the beetle we made last month. Those legs were even more tricky than this. So you can see here that I'm just pinning the foot onto the bottom of the leg, and then we will use a ladder stitch to attach both of those together. So now we're going to be starting on our eyes. So we're going to be doing the realistic eyes using the acrylic half domes or half spheres. If you type that into eBay, you should see a bunch of them come up. That's just usually where I buy them from. That you can usually get them from super cheap from China. They will take a little bit longer to get to you though, so maybe a few weeks. But I usually just order them, so I have a whole stock of different sizes on hand. Now you're going to be painting the back of these acrylic half spheres with acrylic paint. That's just one method that you can use. I'm going to be painting the pupils first. So when you're painting these, you're painting the top layer that you're going to be viewing from the opposite side first. So you need to paint the pupil, then sort of any details, then your backing colour. And you also need to keep in mind that when you paint on the back of these spheres, everything is going to be magnified. So even if you paint like a tiny little pupil, that's going to blow up many, many times. So sort of start off small and then look through the opposite side. Do I like the size and positioning of this pupil? If it's too big, you can sort of rub it off with water or a wet paintbrush or a sponge or something and start again. But just keep in mind that yeah, it is going to amplify your shapes and any sort of mistakes that you make painting these. I just went with sort of a slit eye. You could make them have sort of more cat-like eyes with wider pupils, but that's just what I went with. And you need to let each layer of this dry one at a time. So now my pupils have dried. You can see what they look like here. And now I'm just going to be doing some quick details, sort of like the, I don't know if you call them the veins of the eyes or the details, the striations of the eyes. I'm just going to be using a dark brown because I found some reference images of a gecko with sort of gold and dark brown striped eyes. I think they can have all different colours, but just, you know, pick whatever you want to go with for this particular gecko. So I used that brown acrylic paint and I just got a teeny tiny paintbrush and I just painted a whole bunch of striations starting from inside of that pupil and sort of flaring outwards in each direction. And some of that was opaque, some of it was clear, and sort of that difference between the thickness of the striations and the different patterns that sort of those brush strokes make sort of a more realistic looking eye. So this is a really nice quick way to get a very realistic looking eye. You can see that I'm using a really tiny paintbrush. You can get these at like model making stores. You don't have to have a super tiny paintbrush, but when you're painting these striations, you can't really have a super thick one either. So try and get as small a paintbrush as you can, or you could sort of MacGyver something. You could get a few hairs and tape them together and cut them short or something like that. But yeah, you just want to paint these teeny tiny little striations starting from the inside and going to the outside. You could use multiple colours if you wanted, but I just wanted to keep things simple and I think these eyes turned out really pretty. You might also need to let certain layers dry before you start to add more, as they can kind of muddy and blend together. So you can just see I'm painting little wiggles starting from the inside and going outside. I think I did a couple of layers of these wiggles, letting them dry in between, and that was pretty much it for the detailing. So you can see that I've added a little bit more brown here and done a couple of layers, and then the last layer that we're going to do, which is going to be the furthest back when viewed from the front, is I'm just going to do a nice flat layer of gold, and that sort of metallic paint looked really good on the finished eyes. It gives them a really lifelike kind of sheen. So if you can go metallic, if you can find a metallic paint, that's awesome. These aren't like super expensive paints, they're just an artist acrylic that I've had for probably about 10 years that have been sitting in drawers. But yeah, I just added covered the entire back piece with that gold acrylic. I think I did 2 layers because it was a little bit transparent. So just do as many layers as you think you'll need. Keep in mind that this is going to be pressed up against the white of the gecko's face if you're making yours white as well. So you could hold that up to a piece of white minky, for example. Is this gold enough? Or maybe if you were making an orange gecko, you could hold it up and is too much of that orange showing through? Do I need to do another flat layer of that base back colour? It's all up to you, but you really sort of want to let these layers very much dry, and definitely fully dry before you glue them onto your gecko's head, which is what I'm going to show you guys how to do in a little bit. But I just painted these eyes as I was making the rest of the gecko's pieces. So I would paint one layer, cut out a bunch of pieces, paint one layer, sew those pieces, paint one layer, hand sew the tail, you know, and all that sort of thing. So you can kind of space it out if you want to, or you can paint this sort of at a separate time. You can also use half glass spheres, so acrylic or glass. If you're just painting with acrylic, there's not too much problem, but with these acrylic spheres, if you put like certain aggressive glues on the back of them, they can have chemical reactions occasionally. It doesn't happen too often. The glass ones are less likely to have that happen, but really, you know, you shouldn't have any problem whether you go acrylic or glass, so just get what's available to you. They essentially do the exact same thing and look exactly the same. So you can see here that I've hand sewed the tail onto the body, I've hand sewed the back of the head onto the front of the neck, and I've hand sewed the feet to the legs, and I've hand sewed the legs to the body. So it's just using a simple ladder stitch. There's lots and lots of tutorials for doing a ladder stitch out there on YouTube. I get a lot of people asking me how to do it, but if you just search ladder stitch tutorial, there'll be heaps on YouTube, so I don't really feel like I need to make a tutorial because there's already so many out there for free. So now what we're going to be doing is we're going to be doing the thread sculpting on our leopard gecko, and I'm going to be using a doll needle. So you can see this needle that I'm holding here, which is very large. This is called a doll needle, so D-O-L-L. And you're going to be doubling over your thread and putting it through the eye of that needle, and then tying a knot at the end. You want to try and use a stronger thread if you can. This is going to be pulled quite tight, and you want to try and make a long length as long as you sort of think you can deal with without it getting tangled. So this is kind of the length that I tend to deal with when I'm doing thread sculpting. I'm using a product called Thread Magic. Some of you might know that this has gone out of stock. They're not making it anymore. So I'm sort of holding on to the last little bit of it that I have, but you really want to wax any sort of thread that you're going to be using for thread sculpting because it is so long. It does have that tendency to tangle and knot, so you want to try and make it as smooth and lovely as possible. So you can see me here, I'm adding in a pin sort of where every loop around his tail I want to put in, and I'm doing this sort of to mark it out for myself visually, and this is also going to help us with thread sculpting all of these loops. It's going to give our fabric something to sort of brace against as we loop it around a bunch of times and pull it nice and tight, and then tie little knots in the end, preferably underneath the tail. So I've added a pin every single place that I want a loop. I've got my thread already, and I'm going to start doing the thread sculpting for the tail. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. It was just a particular detail that I thought would be nice to add. You could do straight stitch on the flat pieces of fabric, and that would still do a bit of an indent. Or you could, if you were using printed minky, you could draw the indents in. This is a little bit more fiddly and perhaps not suitable for children. If they're aggressive and rip at this thread sculpting, it can sort of snap the thread if they were really rough with it. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're going to be thread sculpting a tail like this. It's more suited to an adult plush collector. So what I'm going to do is I've got my thread, and I'm going to start sort of where the front of the tail and the back of the body is, and I'm going to try and hide the knot of our thread through that seam, and I'm going to come up where our first pin is, and then I'm going to go around the tail a whole bunch of times, trying to keep it nice and tight, and then I'm going to come back up to the top, do a little loop over the thread that we've made the loop with, just to keep it sort of held in place, and then I'm going to continue on to finish every single loop on this tail. So it does take quite a while, it is a bit fiddly, but just do a bit of a practice first if you need to, and you can go ahead and follow those same steps for every single loop on the tail, just tying it off and making a new run of thread every time that you run out. I usually go around each sort of loop maybe 3 times with a doubled over thread, and I find that that holds the shape nicely. So sometimes it can be easier not to necessarily start from the base of the tail. You can start from the middle and work outwards, just whatever works easier for you. I ended up starting from the middle and working outwards. It was just a little bit easier because the thread is less likely to slip when you tighten it. So you want to make sure that you have that pin there so that when you pull the fabric tight, for example if we're doing a ring at the back of the tail, if we pull it tight, we don't want that ring to sort of slip and constrict and sort of pull itself further down the tail. So you need to use that pin to sort of give it something to brace against as you pull it nice and tight, and that's going to stop it from slipping down the tail or in the wrong direction. And then, as I mentioned earlier, when you're finished going around a few times and getting it to the tightness that you like, bring your needle up back to the top and do a little hop over very tightly against the thread, so up one side over and down the other side of the thread, and that's just like a little tack stitch, a little loopy stitch over the top, and that's going to stop your thread sculpting from slipping and coming out of place, because it is sort of constricting by nature, and we do have this tail that is thinning from the front to the back. The next thing we're going to do is even more thread sculpting. So you can see that we sort of have our eyebrows bulging out for our gecko here, or our eyelids, and what we want to do is we want to make like a little concave cavity where his half glass eyes or half acrylic eyes are going to sit, because if we attach them as it is now, they're just going to be way too bug-eyed and pushed out way too much. So we're going to repeat the same process in preparing our thread, doubling it over, adding sort of some sort of wax, and then we're going to pretty much thread sculpt by just going from one side of where sort of his eye is going to go under that eyebrow to the other, and pulling it tight every time you go from one side to the other. And yeah, you just wanted to create sort of a bit more of a concave shape, like eye sockets where we're going to be gluing his eyes in. You don't need to go too crazy, you don't want to distort the entire shape of the head, but you do want to make it so that underneath those eyebrows it's not bulging out so much, and we have sort of a little cavity where we can glue our eye in there, and it's going to look nice. And you can sort of spread your stitches out between the entire sort of width of underneath that eyebrow, as long as it's going to be covered up by your acrylic eye. It doesn't really matter, you're not going to see those stitches, so they're just functioning to pinch in that eye at those two sides. And then once you're finished, you've got it to sort of a nice shape, you can just tie it off with a couple of knots and cut the thread, and no one is going to know that that thread sculpting is underneath there. You'll have to forgive me, I think I've lost a little bit of footage of me gluing the eyes on, but really you're just going to smother the back of these half acrylic eyes in hot glue, and you're going to press them into the eye sockets, and you want that hot glue to seep around the edges a little bit, so that's going to kind of create like a cup that is like hugging around the edges of these acrylic eyes. If you just put glue on the back and it doesn't sort of seep and bind around the edges, you're just going to be able to pop it right off. So think of it as it's kind of pushing in, and the glue is wrapping around those edges of the eye so that it can't really be pulled out. These kind of eyes are also not really suitable for children, because if you put a lot of force into trying to rip them off, you probably could. It's not going to come off with sort of gentle handling, but yeah, it's not something that I would put on a plush for a child. You could potentially do a similar kind of effect by painting like teddy bear eyes. They're just not going to have sort of that depth that the acrylic has. I also included in the pattern a couple of like little banana shapes, and those are the shapes that we're going to sew and turn inside out and then pin as our eyelids. So to make those, I really just got a couple of pieces of paper, and I guesstimated that it would be kind of like a banana shape for the top and bottom eyelid, and cut that out, you know, tested that on pieces of Minky, and I sewed it like having 2 pieces of each banana for each lid, so that it is like a fully sewn enclosed piece. You could potentially just cut this out of Minky and then hot glue it on, and then just have like a raw edge around the edge of the Minky, but that's a little bit of a rougher look, so I wanted to have a bit more 3D eyelids for the gecko. So you're really just going to make each of those eyelids, so 2 for each side, And then you're going to perhaps bring up some reference images of a gecko, and then you're going to look at where you want to pin those eyelids on. So it's not going to be sort of having the eyelids perfectly horizontal. You're going to sort of, where they meet at the front is down a little bit lower, and where they meet at the back is up a little bit higher if you try to look at gecko reference images. And you want to try and make sure that your eyelids look relatively the same on each side. If that's the look you're going for, you might want to make one with like winky eyes or something like that, but that's just something to keep in mind. And then we're going to be going ahead and we're going to ladder stitch all the way around the outside. So you're not going to be bothering to stitch obviously where the eyelid meets the eye, but you're going to stitch all the way along the outer edge. And this gives sort of a more realistic shape to the eye. If you leave it just with that acrylic sphere, like that big round shape without any eyelids, it kind of looks a little bit derpy. It doesn't look like a real animal. But once you add those eyelids, it really makes a very big difference and makes it look much more realistic. And because of the shape of these acrylic eyes, the pupil is going to look like it's following you regardless of which angle you're sort of looking at it. If you want to find acrylic or glass eyes that are exactly the same size as the ones I used here, I measured them and they're 25mm or 2.5 centimeters. So if you want to work in inches, just type in 25mm 2 inches into Google and it will automatically convert that for you if that's easier for you to find them. But that's the size that I ended up using for this finished plush here. If you like the size of these eyes, you could also potentially go smaller, but these were just the size of the half spheres that I happen to have, but they are a little bit larger than real gecko eyes, so that's something that you can choose depending on what style you want to go for. One of the last things that we need to do to sort of finish the base shape of this plush is we need to thread sculpt the smile. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of good thread sculpting tutorials on YouTube. So what I ended up doing is I sort of did a smile that went horizontally all the way across like the front of the mouth up to most of the way along the side pieces, and then it sort of perked up sort of on a diagonal and back. So what I ended up doing, I think I redid this a couple of times to get the smile as I wanted it, but I put pins in place everywhere where the smile is going to sort of change direction. So, and as well, I put a couple at the front of the nose so that when we're pulling it tight, it's not going to sort of slip down the nose and completely ruin the positioning of where we want that smile to be. But really just do one section at a time. You can wrap around the front of the nose, then go side to side, making sure that you go along each path sort of a few times. There's a really good mouth thread sculpting tutorial. I think if you search thread sculpting tutorial Espeon, like the Pokemon Espeon, like the evolution, there's a really good example of someone using thread sculpting on the mouth of a plush there. So that's the tutorial that I think I originally watched when I was learning how to thread sculpt. So it does help to have, you can see me using these pins because it was slipping along the front of the nose. Add pins anywhere that you think your thread is potentially going to slip, and then before you remove those pins, once you've tightened the smile and sort of got that indent that you want, go ahead and do that little loop over, like that little tacking stitch over where the pins are holding the thread in place, so your thread is going to be holding those long loops in place rather than the pins that you've put in. And you might need to do this a couple of times, so I did this twice I think to get the mouth how I wanted. Look up a bunch of images of leopard geckos or whatever type of gecko you're wanting to make, and you can sort of get a rough idea of their mouth shape. You're going to have to simplify it a little bit because it's mostly going to be straight lines that you're thread sculpting, and you can sort of change it if you want them to have like a more cartoony smile. You can do that, or a frown, or whatever you'd like. I think I also went in and thread sculpted some little nostrils, so that's very simple, just going like across, sort of out where the bottom of the nostril is, across, and then down where the top of the nostril is, and doing that on each side a couple of times. But yeah, that's pretty much it for the mouth. If you need to do it a couple of times, don't worry, and just make sure to put those little tacking stitches in where you don't want the thread to accidentally slip, because it is likely to do that because it is under so much pressure and our nose is quite thin and narrow, so it could want to slip up or down depending on where you put the mouth. Another thing you can do is you can use a heat removable marker to pre-draw in the shape of your mouth, and then you can use that as a sort of guide, and then you can go ahead and use like an iron on a low setting with some sort of cloth to protect the plush, or you can even use a hairdryer on a warmer heat, and that will get rid of that heat removable marker, and then you'll be just left with your nice thread sculpting of the mouth. So I went back here and completely redid it again. You can see that I'm using this heat removable marker, and I've just drawn on the little edits that I wanted to make to the mouth, and I redid it once again, and I was really happy with how it came out. So here's what the gecko looks like, completely unairbrushed with no markings or anything. This is just the base pattern made in white, and you can see hopefully it looks a lot like a leopard gecko. I really tried to make it look as much as I possibly could. If you want to go ahead and airbrush it, as I mentioned, I have a beginner's airbrushing tutorial, which is really all you need to know, or you can watch some of my more advanced airbrushing tutorials, which might show you a couple of tips to sort of get that gecko morph pattern that you would like. This guy can be wiggled a little bit, sort of at any intersection where it's been hand sewn, so the tail wiggles a bit, the neck wiggles a bit if you sort of hold it and wrangle it a little bit, which is fun for photos and videos. But this is essentially what he looks like. I went ahead and did a bunch of airbrushing, just a session of airbrushing, and because most of the leopard geckos sort of have a white base colour moving on to like different colours of yellow and orange with spots, it was just much easier for me to airbrush all of those to get a very realistic effect. He can't be handled very roughly, but he's fine to be sort of handled gently and be mostly display plush, but that airbrushing really gives a very realistic sort of vision of what that gecko would look like, and is much easier than sort of doing embroidery or applique for every single one of those spots. But I would definitely recommend trying out this pattern with something like Spoonflower Printed Minky, because you could just go nuts drawing all the different spots and patterns, and leopard geckos come in so many cool colours and morphs. And this pattern doesn't have too many seams, so you should be able to create a spoonflower design quite easily for it. I just ask that you don't sort of publicise the pattern on Spoonflower, because that is an option when you create sort of custom fabric prints. But I hope you guys use this pattern. Please tag me. I really want to see everyone's geckos. I've heard a few people saying that they're getting ready to make their own. So yeah, please tag me on social media if you do make one, and I'll make sure to feature it on like Twitter and Instagram and stuff like that if everyone wants to send me their geckos. I'm really keen to see all the different sort of colours and morphs and stuff that you guys make. But if you have any questions, if I missed anything or any of this is too confusing, please send me a message on Patreon via their private message, or you can send me a message on any of my social media accounts, and I'll do my best to sort of help you through it and make sure that you can make the gecko that you want to make. Another thing that you could potentially do with this pattern, I have an open mouth patterning tutorial that I made a while back that would be perfect to use with this kind of gecko. If you want to make your gecko with an open smiling mouth, I think that would be really cool. But yeah, those glass eyes came out really awesome. They really look super realistic, and they sort of follow you wherever you go because of the nature of that sort of sphere shape and how it amplifies the painted section underneath. But you could absolutely use like embroidery or teddy bear eyes or something like that if you want to sort of make a different kind of eye for your gecko. But anyway, good luck making your geckos. Thanks so much for sticking with me through all of this, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!